Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead, and it's time to continue in our story, Farmer Boy, by Laura Ingalls Wilder. So today's chapter 19, is called Early Harvest, and I'll just show you the picture that they put on this one. What do you think that is? Now it was haying time. Father brought out the scythe, and Almanzo turned the grindstone with one hand and poured a little stream of water on it with the other hand. So that's what this is. This is a grindstone right there. And Father would be cranking it, and Almanzo would be using this pour little water to help sharpen the scythes, which were the cutting tools. While Father held the steel edges delicately against the whirling stone. The water kept the scythes from getting too hot, while the stone ground the edges thin and sharp. Better for cutting that way. Then Almanzo went through the woods to the little French cabins and told French Joe and Lazy John to come work in the morning. As soon as the sun dried the dew in the meadows, Father and Joe and John began cutting the hay. They walked side by side, swinging their scythes in the tall grass, and the plumed Timothy hay fell in great swaths, so a great bunch of them would fall at one time. Swish, swish, swish went the scythes, while Almanzo and Pierre and Louise followed behind them, spreading out the heavy swaths with pitchforks so that they would dry evenly in the sunshine. The stubble was soft and cool under their bare feet. Birds flew up before the mowers. Now and then a rabbit jumped and bounded away. High up in the air, the meadowlark sang. The sun grew hotter. The smell of the hay grew stronger and sweeter. Then waves of heat began to come up from the ground. Almanzo's brown arms burned even browner, and sweat trickled down his forehead. The men stopped to put green leaves in the crowns of their hats, and so did the boys. For a little while the leaves were cool on top of their heads. In the middle of the morning, Mother blew the dinner horn. Almanzo knew what that meant. He stuck his pitchfork in the ground and went running and skipping down across the meadows to the house. Mother met him at the back porch with the pail brimming full of cold eggnog. The eggnog was made of milk and cream, with plenty of eggs and sugar. Its foamy top was freckled with spices, and pieces of ice floated in it. The sides of the pail were misty and cold. Oh my goodness, that sounds so good. I think when I get done with this story, I'm going to make some eggnog. We don't have our own cows to have our own milk, but I do have some in the fridge. But we do have our own chickens. And we do have ice. Almanzo trudged slowly towards the hayfield with the heavy pail and dipper. He thought to himself that the pail was too full. He might spill some of the eggnog. Mother said waste was sinful. He was sure it would be sinful to waste a drop of that eggnog. He should do something to save it. So he set down the pail, dipped the dipper full, and he drank some. The cold eggnog slid smoothly down his throat, and it made him cool inside. When he reached the hayfield, everybody stopped work. They stood in the shade of an oak and pushed back their hats and passed the dipper from hand to hand till all the eggnog was gone. Almanzo drank his full share. The breeze seemed cool now, and Lazy John said, wiping the foam from his mustache, "Ah, that puts heart into a man." Now the men whetted their scythes, making the whetstone ring gaily on the steel blades. Now they kept their tools really sharp because a sharp tool makes the work much easier. And they went back to work with a will. Father always maintained that a man could do more in his 12 hours if he had rest and all the eggnog he could drink morning and afternoon. They all worked in the hayfield as long as there was light enough to see what they were doing, and the chores were done by lantern light. Next morning the swaths had dried, and the boys raked them in the windrows. Not windows, windrows. Into windrows with big light wooden rakes that Father had made. Then Joe and John went on cutting hay, and Pierre and Louise spread the swaths behind them, but Almanzo worked on the hay rack. Father drove it up from the barns, and Father and Arroyo pitched the windrows into it, while Almanzo trampled them down. So they were throwing it up into that, and Almanzo would get to step on it. Back and forth he ran on the sweet-smelling hay, packing it down as fast as Father and Royal pitched it into the rack. When the rack would hold no more, he was high in the air on top of the load. There he lay on his stomach and he kicked up his heels, while Father drove down to the big barn. The load of hay barely squeezed under the tall doorway, and it was a long slide to the ground. Father and Royal pitched the hay into the hay bow, while Almanzo took the water jug to the well. He pumped, then jumped, and he caught the gushing cold water in his hand and he drank. He carried water to Father and Royal, and he filled the jug again. Then he rode back in the empty hay rack and trampled down another load. Almanzo liked haying time. From dawn till long after dark every day he was busy doing different things. It was like playing, and morning and afternoon there was cold eggnog. But after 3 weeks of making hay, all the hay mows were crammed to bursting and the meadows were bare. Then the rush of harvest time came. The oats were ripe, standing thick and tall and yellow. The wheat was golden, darker than the oats. The beans were ripe, and pumpkins and carrots and turnips and potatoes were ready to gather. There was no rest and no play for anyone now. They all worked from candlelight to candlelight. Mother and the girls were making cucumber pickles, green tomato pickles, and watermelon rind pickles. They were drying corn and apples and making preserves, which is like jellies. Everything must be saved. Nothing must be wasted of all summer's bounty. Even the apple cores were saved for making vinegar. I do that too. And a bundle of oat straw was soaking in the tub on the back porch. Whenever Mother had a minute or two to spare, she braided an inch or two of straw braid for making next summer's hats. The oats were not cut with scythes, but with cradles. Cradles had blades like scythes, but they also had long wooden teeth that caught the cut stalks and held them. When they had cut enough for each bundle, Joe and John slid the stalks off into neat piles. Father and Royal and Almanzo followed behind, binding them or tying them into sheaves. Almanzo had never bound oats before. Father showed him how to knot 2 handfuls of stalks into a long band, then how to gather up an armful of grain. Pull the band tightly around the middle, twist its ends together, and tuck them in tightly. In a little while he could bind a sheaf pretty well, but not very fast. Father and Royal could bind oats as fast as the reapers cut them. Just before sunset, the reapers stopped reaping, and they all began shocking the sheaves. All the cut oats must be shucked before dark, because they would spoil if they laid on the ground in the dew overnight. Almanzo could shuck oats as well as anybody. He stood 10 sheaves up on the stem ends, close together with the heads of grain pointed up. Then he set 2 more sheaves on top, spread out their stems to make a little roof over the 10 sheaves. The shucks looked like little Indian wigwams, dotted all over the field of pale stubble. So here's what it looked like. Look, even the girls were out there helping. The wheat field was waiting. There was no time to lose. As soon as the oats were in the shuck, everyone hurried to cut and bind and shuck the wheat. It was harder to handle because it was heavier than oats, but Almanzo manfully did his best. Then there was a field of oats and Canadian peas. The pea vines were tangled all through the oats, so they could not be shucked. Almanzo raked them into long windrows. Already it was high time to pull the navy beans. That's a dry bean. Alice had helped with them. Father hauled the bean stakes to the field and set them up, driving them into the ground with a maul. Then Father and Royal hauled the shucked grain into the barns, while Almanzo and Alice pulled the beans. First, they laid rocks all around the bean stakes to keep the beans off the ground. Then they pulled up the beans. With both hands they pulled till their hands would hold no more. They carried the beans to the stakes and laid the roots against them, spreading the long vines out on the rocks. Layer after layer of beans they piled around each stake. The roots were bigger than the vines, so the pile grew higher in the middle. The tangled vines, full of rattling bean pods, hung down all around. When the roots were piled to the tops of the stakes, Almanzo and Alice laid vines over the top, making a little roof that would shed the rain. Then that bean stake was done, and they began another. The stake were as tall as Almanzo. Remember, he was 9 years old, and the vines stood out around like Alice's hoop skirts. One day when Almanzo and Alice came to dinner, the butter buyer was there. He came every year from New York City. He wore fine city clothes with a gold watch and a chain, and he drove a good team. Everybody liked the butter buyer, and dinner time was exciting when he was there. He brought all the news of politics and fashions and prices from New York City. After dinner, Almanzo went back to work, but Alice stayed to watch Mother sell the butter. The butter buyer went down to the cellar where the butter tubs stood, covered with clean white cloths. Mother took off the cloths, and the butter buyer pushed his long steel butter tester down through the butter to the bottom of the tub. The butter tester was hollow, with a slit in one side, so it was almost like a pencil. And he'd push it down, and butter would go up through that little slit, through the hollow part. When he pulled it out, there in the slit was a long sample of butter. Mother did not do any bargaining at all. She said proudly, "My butter speaks for itself." Not one sample from all of her tubs had a streak in it. From top to bottom of every tub, Mother's butter was the same golden, firm, sweet butter. Almanzo saw the butter buyer drive away, and Alice came skipping to the bean field, swinging her sunbonnet by its string. She called out, "Guess what he did?" "What?" Almanzo asked. "He said Mother's butter is the best butter he ever saw anywhere. And he paid her, guess what he paid her? 50 cents a pound." Almanzo was amazed. He had never heard of such a price for butter. "She had 500 pounds, Alice said. "That's $250. He paid her all that money, and she's hitching right now to go to the bank." In a little while, Mother drove away in her second best bonnet and her black bombazine. She was going to town in the afternoon on a weekday at harvest time. She had never done such a thing before. But Father was busy in the fields, and she would not keep all that money in the house overnight. Almanzo was proud. His mother was probably the best butter maker in the whole of New York State. People in New York City would eat it and say to one another how good it was. And I wonder who made it. Wow, that was busy time for them. I can't blame Mother for wanting to get rid of it, especially after what happened when they had money from the horse fire. Do you remember that? And that mysterious dog showed up and scared off whoever was out there that had intended to rob them. She was smart. Well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I want to pray blessings on you and yours, in your house, out of your house, in the day and the night. Whatever you do, keep dreaming. And I sure hope you're liking these stories. All right, bye-bye.